The scream echoed through Timberline, a sound so chilling it could freeze your blood. But when the authorities arrived to investigate, the cabin where it came from was gone. No trace of the missing woman, no evidence, just an unsettling silence that still haunts the town to this day. As Timberline's dark secrets continue to linger in the woods, the truth behind the screams remains buried in the silence. Was it the town's cursed past or something more sinister? If you had the chance to uncover the truth, would you dare to stay a night in Timberline? The scream echoed through the still night air, a primal sound that ripped through the forest, waking even the most hardened of souls. It was the kind of scream that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end, a sound so raw and desperate that it seemed to carry the weight of something far worse than human fear. For those who heard it, the experience lingered in their minds like a shadow, one they couldn't quite shake even as years passed. It wasn't the kind of sound you forget. It burrowed into your thoughts, leaving you wondering if something had died in that moment or if something had been awakened. In the winter of 2003, Timberline, a remote town deep in the Oregon wilderness, was a quiet place, the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else. A town of just a few hundred souls, nestled between towering pines and thick forests, it felt isolated from the world, untouched by the hustle and noise of the outside. The locals liked it that way, content with their peaceful, mundane lives. But as the events of that winter unfolded, Timberline would never be the same. What began as a missing person case soon spiraled into something much darker, a mystery that would haunt the town and those who dared to investigate it. Jennifer Hartley was the first to disappear. A local woman in her early 20s, Jennifer was known around Timberline for her quiet demeanor and love of the outdoors. She worked as a waitress at the small diner, where she spent most of her days chatting with customers and dreaming of a life beyond Timberline's borders. It wasn't unusual for Jennifer to go out for long walks in the woods. The town had always felt safe, and she had grown up in the very woods she now explored, her familiarity with the land making her feel invincible. But that winter, Jennifer ventured deeper into the forest than she ever had before. Her disappearance was subtle at first, unnoticed by many. Her friends and family thought she was simply taking a break from her usual routine, maybe going on a solo hike or spending time reflecting on her life. It wasn't until days passed, and Jennifer didn't return any calls or messages, that concern began to grow. By then, the snow had begun to fall heavily, blanketing Timberline in a thick layer of white that made the forest seem even more treacherous. Search teams were dispatched, and for days they combed through the woods, finding nothing. No footprints, no signs of a struggle, just an unnerving silence that hung in the air. Jennifer had vanished without a trace, like she had been swallowed whole by the forest itself. But it wasn't just Jennifer's sudden disappearance that unsettled the town, it was the scream. The night she went missing, a group of hikers near the Timberline Overlook, a popular vantage point that overlooked the town, reported hearing something they would never forget. The scream was unmistakable, echoing through the trees like a cry for help, but it was different from anything they had heard before. It wasn't the scream of an animal or the wind. This was a human scream filled with anguish and terror. One of the hikers, a woman named Rachel, described the sound as otherworldly. She said it was as if the scream came from somewhere deep in the forest, somewhere they couldn't reach. It was loud yet distant, as if it belonged to someone who wasn't quite there, trapped between this world and something else. The hikers reported the scream to the authorities, but when the search teams went out the following morning, they found nothing. No footprints, no sign of anyone in distress. Just the eerie stillness of the trees, their branches heavy with snow. The authorities dismissed it as the sounds of the wilderness, something that was not uncommon in the Oregon woods, but Rachel knew what she had heard. She couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister was at play. The local police didn't have many leads, and as days turned into weeks, the search grew more desperate. Still, there was no sign of Jennifer, no clues, just the whisper of her name on the wind, a name that seemed to carry with it an unspoken warning. It wasn't until a year later that the mystery took another dark turn. A pair of hikers, this time a young couple, stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin deep in the woods, just beyond Timberline's outskirts. The cabin was hidden from view, covered in ivy and forgotten by time. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years, if not decades. The hikers, curious and unaware of the weight the place carried, ventured inside. They found old furniture covered in dust, old newspapers that crumbled at the touch, and a collection of photographs pinned to the walls, pictures of people long gone, their faces faded and barely recognizable. But there was one photograph that stood out among the others, a faded black and white image of a young woman, Jennifer Hartley. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with what could only be described as fear, her hand clutching something in the corner of the frame. It was difficult to make out what she was holding, but there was something unsettling about the way her fingers curled around it, as if she was gripping it for dear life. Beneath the photograph, written in slanted handwriting, were the words, "She's coming. She knows." The hikers immediately called the police, but when authorities arrived, they found nothing. The cabin had vanished. The only thing that remained was the photograph, which had somehow ended up in the hands of the hikers, now held as evidence. When the local police returned to the area, searching for any trace of the cabin, they found only trees and snow. No signs of where it had stood. The whole situation felt strange, as if the cabin had never existed in the first place. But the photograph, Jennifer's photograph, remained, its cryptic message a chilling reminder that something was wrong in the woods of Timberline. As the investigation into Jennifer's disappearance stalled, more strange events began to occur. People started reporting unexplained sightings near the Timberline overlook. Some claimed to see shadowy figures moving among the trees, others swore they saw lights in the distance at night. The town, once so quiet and isolated, seemed to have become a magnet for the bizarre. The screams that had once been dismissed now became something people feared, a sound that seemed to travel with the wind. No one could explain it, but those who heard it couldn't deny the terror that it invoked. The local authorities had no answers. They filed the case away as unsolved, a mystery with no resolution. But the strange occurrences didn't stop. Timberline, once a sleepy town, had become a place that no one wanted to visit, a place where the dead seemed to linger, their voices rising from the depths of the forest. And for those who remained, the question was always the same. What happened to Jennifer Hartley? And why, in the dead of night, did the woods of Timberline seem to call her name? The town's answer, if it could be called that, came in whispers. Some said Jennifer had stumbled into something she shouldn't have, that she had seen something in the woods, something ancient, something that had been waiting for her. Others believed the town itself was cursed, a place where the past had come to collect its debt. But no matter how many theories were proposed, the truth remained elusive. And in the quiet of the night, when the wind howled through the trees, the screams would always return. The investigation continued, but Timberline was changing. Those who lived there began to question everything. Was it possible that the woods held something beyond human understanding? Or was there something in the very soil of Timberline that had drawn the screams from the darkness, something waiting for those who ventured too far into the night? The investigation continued, but Timberline was changing. Those who lived there began to question everything. Was it possible that the woods held something beyond human understanding? Or was there something in the very soil of Timberline that had drawn the screams from the darkness, something waiting for those who ventured too far into the night? As more time passed, the unsettling events only seemed to grow in frequency. The locals began to avoid the woods entirely, steering clear of the Timberline overlook, where the screams had first been heard. Yet, despite their fear, something deep inside them knew that the truth about Jennifer's disappearance and the other strange occurrences was still out there, buried somewhere in the forest's dark, quiet depths. In the years that followed, the town saw more strange disappearances, each one more inexplicable than the last. But none was as disturbing as the case of Kyle Turner, a local man who had been a close friend of Jennifer's. Kyle had always been skeptical of the supernatural rumors circulating around Timberline. A man of logic, he had dismissed the whispers of curses, hauntings, and strange lights as nothing more than the product of overactive imaginations. But that was before the night he decided to go looking for answers. It was late in the spring of 2006 when Kyle ventured into the woods alone. The town had been haunted by stories of the screams for years, and Kyle had reached a point where he couldn't ignore them any longer. His friend was gone, and no one seemed to have any answers. As a person who believed in facts and reason, Kyle couldn't understand why the town was so gripped by fear. He needed to see for himself. He needed to know if there was something truly supernatural lurking in the shadows. Kyle had been hiking for hours, his flashlight cutting through the inky blackness of the forest. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the silence was almost suffocating. His thoughts were consumed by the mystery of Jennifer's disappearance and the unanswered questions that had lingered for years. What was it about this place that had taken her? Why had she disappeared without a trace? He couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking in her footsteps, following a trail that was meant to lead him somewhere. But to where exactly? As the night grew colder, the forest seemed to close in around him. The trees stretched high above, their branches twisting and intertwining, blocking out any trace of moonlight. It was as if the woods themselves were trying to hide something. And then, just as Kyle thought he was alone, he heard it, the scream. It was distant at first, barely audible over the rustling of the leaves. But as he continued walking, it grew louder, more distinct. The sound was unmistakable, a raw, desperate cry that seemed to reverberate through his very bones. It was the same scream that had been reported in 2003, the one that had haunted the town ever since. His heart raced, and a cold chill ran down his spine as he realized the truth. He wasn't alone in the woods. Something was watching him, and it was waiting. Kyle froze, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. He scanned the darkness, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The woods seemed to shift, the shadows playing tricks on his eyes. Then from out of nowhere, a figure appeared, a tall, dark silhouette standing just beyond the reach of his light. For a moment, Kyle's mind struggled to make sense of what he was seeing. The figure was human, yet somehow wrong. It was as if it didn't belong, like it was an image pulled from a nightmare and thrust into the waking world. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, watching him, its presence as cold and foreboding as the forest itself. Kyle's breath caught in his throat, his feet rooted to the ground. He couldn't bring himself to look away. And then in an instant, the figure vanished, gone like smoke in the wind. He stood there in stunned silence, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But as the echoes of the scream continued to haunt the night air, Kyle knew one thing for certain: he had encountered something that defied explanation. The next morning, Kyle stumbled back into town, pale and shaken. He tried to explain what had happened, but his words faltered. How could he describe the unexplainable, the feeling of being watched by something not quite human, the terror of a scream that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth itself? The townspeople listened, their faces drawn with concern, but no one seemed surprised, as if they had been waiting for someone to finally understand. Kyle had experienced what they all feared. That Timberline was more than just a town. It was a place where the past and the present collided, a place where the dead could not rest. Over the next few months, Kyle became obsessed with the mystery. He pored over every document related to Jennifer's disappearance, every scrap of evidence he could find. It wasn't long before he discovered something chilling, a pattern. The missing persons cases in Timberline, though scattered over the years, seemed to follow a strange and unnatural rhythm. People would vanish, leaving behind no trace of their whereabouts, and then months later, the scream would ring out. The town seemed to be caught in a cycle of disappearance, a cycle that no one could break. He began to investigate the origins of the Bennett family, whose name had come up repeatedly in the research. The Bennetts were not just an old family of farmers. They were descendants of the original settlers who had built Timberline, and their history was steeped in mystery. Old records revealed that the Bennetts had been involved in various rituals dating back to the 1800s, rituals that, according to the town's oldest residents, were designed to communicate with the spirits of the forest. While some dismissed these as mere superstition, others believed the rituals were far more than just old wives' tales. The more Kyle uncovered, the more he began to wonder if the Bennetts were at the heart of the town's curse. The ritualistic symbols carved into trees near the Timberline overlook were just the beginning. The town was filled with strange markings, remnants of an ancient practice that no one truly understood. What had been done to the land? And what had the Bennetts done to invoke such a dark power? But even with all the evidence Kyle had gathered, the pieces still didn't fit. It was as if the town itself had swallowed up the truth, hiding it from those who dared to dig too deep. And as the cold winds began to howl through Timberline once again, Kyle realized the horror he had stumbled upon might never be fully understood. The answers were buried somewhere in the forest, but they came with a price, and there were only a few brave enough to pay it. Kyle's investigation would continue, but the path ahead was clear. Whatever lay ahead in the dark woods, whatever secret Timberline held, would not be easily uncovered. And as long as the scream echoed through the trees, the town would remain lost, forever trapped in its own history. Kyle's investigation would continue, but the path ahead was clear. Whatever lay ahead in the dark woods, whatever secret Timberline held, would not be easily uncovered. And as long as the scream echoed through the trees, the town would remain lost, forever trapped in its own history. For weeks, he scoured every corner of Timberline, every old document, and every obscure rumor that might give him a clue about the eerie disappearances. He dug into the town's records, reading through ancient newspaper clippings, court files, and old police reports that seemed to lead nowhere, only to circle back to the same terrifying question. Why had Timberline become a magnet for the strange and the sinister? And why were some souls never able to leave? The more Kyle uncovered, the more he came to believe that there was something far older and darker at work in Timberline than anyone had suspected. It wasn't just the Bennett family's rituals, nor the seemingly random disappearances. It was something embedded into the land itself, something deeply tied to the forest, to the very soil beneath Timberline. There were whispers, of course, whispers of old legends that spoke of a time long before Timberline had been settled by the first European pioneers. The local tribes, before they were driven out, spoke of the forest as being a place of spirits, not just the spirits of the dead, but spirits that had always been there, tied to the very heartbeat of the earth itself. They spoke of an ancient power that had watched over the land long before the settlers came, and they feared that this power would not take kindly to the intrusion of humans. Kyle's research had led him to a burial site, a small patch of land just beyond the town's edge, hidden deep within the trees. The place had been neglected, almost forgotten by the locals, who had long since abandoned it. Yet Kyle knew it was important. There was a strange energy in the air as he stood at the edge of the site. It was a place that held memories, but memories that had been suppressed, hidden away beneath layers of time. When Kyle first approached the burial ground, he noticed the ground was oddly disturbed, as though someone had recently dug there. The earth was freshly turned, but it was the markings that caught his attention. Carved into the stones that surrounded the site were symbols, similar to those he had seen near the Timberline overlook. He knelt down, his heart racing as he studied the engravings. There were images of trees, roots, and a circle that seemed to represent the moon. But more unsettling than the symbols were the words. They were written in a language that Kyle didn't recognize, but there was one word he understood: Timberline. His mind raced as he pieced it all together. It wasn't just the Bennetts who had been involved in these ancient rites. The land itself had been marked, bound to something older and more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. The Bennetts might have had their rituals, but it was the land that had been cursed long before they arrived. And Jennifer's disappearance, along with the others, was part of a much larger pattern, a cycle that had been repeating itself for generations. Kyle's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden sound from the woods. It was the unmistakable snap of a twig, followed by the rustle of leaves. He wasn't alone. Panic flooded through him as he spun around, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. His flashlight flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the trees. He was on edge, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he waited for something, anything, to emerge from the forest. The silence that followed felt deafening. The air was heavy, thick with an unnatural stillness, and then he heard it, the scream. It was faint at first, like a distant echo carried by the wind, but it grew louder, more intense, until it seemed to surround him from every direction. The scream was unmistakable, a primal cry that sent a shiver down his spine. Kyle froze, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. His hands trembled as he gripped his flashlight, trying to steady his breathing. It was the same scream he had heard about, the one that had haunted the town for years, but this time it was closer, too close. And then through the trees he saw it, a figure. A shadow moving swiftly among the trunks, its form indistinct and shifting, as if it were more a part of the forest than a person. Kyle's heart pounded in his chest as he stumbled backward, his mind racing for an explanation. Was it one of the Bennetts, a member of the family, or someone else who had been drawn into this twisted legacy? Or was it something else entirely? Something older, something that had been here long before Timberline had ever existed. The figure vanished before Kyle could react, but the scream remained, ringing in his ears like a cruel reminder that he was not alone. He had come to Timberline seeking answers, but now he realized that the answers he sought would not come easily if they ever came at all. And what's worse, he had a terrifying sense that the deeper he dug, the more he would uncover about the town's dark past, about the things that had been buried for a reason. When Kyle made his way back to town, he was shaken to his core. The sight of the figure in the woods, the scream, and the chilling realization that Timberline's mysteries were far from solved weighed heavily on his mind. He knew he had to keep searching. But what if searching only led to more questions? What if there were no answers? Or worse, what if the town's secrets were too dangerous to unearth? Kyle's encounter in the woods was just the beginning of a new chapter in his investigation. He knew that the truth was out there, hidden deep within Timberline's history, but the closer he got to it, the more he began to fear what he might find. And as he began to dig deeper into the Bennett family's past, he realized that their involvement in the rituals might have been more than just a local superstition. It might have been the key to understanding the scream that had plagued the town for so long. In the following weeks, Kyle interviewed the town's elders, hoping to piece together fragments of Timberline's forgotten history. It wasn't easy. Most of the older residents had long since stopped talking about the town's strange past, and those who did were often vague, unwilling, or too afraid to say anything of substance. But one old man in particular had a different story to tell. His name was Earl Thompson, and he had lived in Timberline his entire life. Earl was a recluse, living on the outskirts of town, in a dilapidated house that had once belonged to his father. When Kyle approached him, he was hesitant at first, but eventually Earl opened up. "The Bennetts," Earl said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They weren't the only ones. There's something. Something older, something that's been in these woods for longer than anyone knows. It was here long before any of us settled. And that scream, it's the sound of those who got too close, too curious. If you go looking for the truth in Timberline, you might just find it, but you might not come back the same. Not everyone does." Kyle felt a chill crawl up his spine as he listened to Earl's words. The old man's cryptic warning echoed in his mind as he made his way back to the woods, where the answer, whatever it was, awaited, hidden in the shadows, waiting for someone to uncover it. But the more Kyle searched, the more he realized that Timberline's secrets would not be easy to unearth. Some things, it seemed, were better left buried. Kyle felt a chill crawl up his spine as he listened to Earl's words. The old man's cryptic warning echoed in his mind as he made his way back to the woods, where the answer, whatever it was, awaited, hidden in the shadows, waiting for someone to uncover it. But the more Kyle searched, the more he realized that Timberline's secrets would not be easy to unearth. Some things, it seemed, were better left buried. The weight of Earl's warning hung over him like a dark cloud as he prepared for the next step of his investigation. Despite the mounting terror and confusion, there was something inside Kyle that refused to turn away. He couldn't ignore what he had heard, what he had seen, and most importantly, what he believed was waiting to be found. With the knowledge that Timberline's past held more than just a few old tales, Kyle turned his focus back to the Bennetts. There was no question now, they were at the center of it all. The strange rituals, the disappearances, the screams in the night, it all pointed to this family, whose roots ran deep in the town's history. The Bennetts' land had always been shrouded in mystery, and every time Kyle thought he had discovered all there was to know, he uncovered something new, something darker. The more he pieced together, the more the image of the Bennetts shifted from a simple farming family to something much more ominous. One evening, Kyle sat down with the only surviving member of the Bennett family, an elderly woman named Ruth Bennett. She had lived in Timberline for her entire life, and despite the town's growing unease, Ruth remained unfazed by the rumors. She had watched her family, generation after generation, tend to the land. And like the others, Ruth knew the town's history better than anyone else. But unlike the others, she was willing to talk. "I've seen what's been happening around here," Ruth said, her voice gravelly with age yet sharp, as if she was finally ready to tell the truth. "I've seen the disappearances, but they've always been a part of Timberline. You have to understand, Kyle, this town was built on something much older than we are. It's not just the Bennetts, not just us, it's the land, the very earth we live on. It's got a mind of its own, and we're just passing through." Ruth's words sent a shiver through Kyle. The idea of the land having a consciousness, of it being alive in some sense, was something he had never considered before. But the more he listened, the more the pieces began to fit together in a way he hadn't expected. This was no ordinary place. Timberline was a town haunted not just by spirits, but by something ancient, something that had been with the land long before the settlers arrived. Something that the Bennetts, for better or worse, had always been tied to. Ruth continued, her face growing pale as she recalled her family's past. "My great-grandfather, he knew the truth. He understood the land better than anyone, but what he didn't realize was that the land had a price that's been paid by those who came before him. It was the land that called to the first settlers, and it called to my family, too. We thought we could tame it, control it, but you can't control what's already been here for centuries." As Ruth spoke, Kyle couldn't shake the feeling that he was hearing a warning. The more he pressed for details, the more Ruth became evasive, her words growing more cryptic. But it was clear that she was afraid of something that had been passed down through generations, something that had been kept hidden from the world. Whatever it was, Ruth knew that it had always been a part of Timberline, and now it was threatening to break free. Kyle left Ruth's house that evening with a heavy heart. The details of the conversation weighed on him, and for the first time he wondered if there was something truly supernatural at play. The missing people, the screams, the disturbing events, they were all connected, and Ruth's cryptic words seemed to confirm what Kyle had been sensing for months. Timberline was not just a place. It was a living, breathing entity, one that had been shaped by an ancient force far older than anything Kyle could comprehend. Determined to find the truth, Kyle returned to the woods the following night, driven by the same obsession that had led him this far. His mind raced as he made his way back to the Timberline overlook, the site where the first scream had been heard. The forest was darker than ever, its towering trees looming overhead, blocking out the light from the moon. It felt as though the woods were closing in on him, suffocating him with their weight. Every crack of a twig beneath his feet sounded like a warning, every gust of wind like a whisper. But Kyle pushed forward, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, the beam flickering as he advanced deeper into the woods. It was then, as he neared the overlook, that he saw it, the figure again. This time it was clearer. The silhouette stood motionless at the edge of the cliff, just beyond the reach of his light. Kyle's pulse quickened. The figure seemed to be waiting for him, as if it had been expecting him all along. For a moment, Kyle hesitated. The logical part of his mind screamed at him to turn back, to leave the woods behind and never look back. But something in him refused to listen. The scream that had haunted the town for so long was growing louder, echoing through the trees like a final warning. The figure, dark and indistinct, slowly turned to face him. Kyle's heart stopped. He couldn't move. His breath came in shallow gasps as the figure's form shifted, its edges blurring, almost as if it were part of the darkness itself. The scream reached a crescendo, its intensity enough to rattle Kyle's bones. And then, through the roar of the noise, he heard a voice. "Turn back, you're too close." The voice was barely a whisper, but it was enough to snap Kyle out of his paralysis. Without thinking, he bolted. The scream seemed to follow him, the figure's presence lingering in his peripheral vision as he ran through the trees, branches scratching at his face and arms. The terror he felt was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It was as if the forest itself was coming alive, closing in around him, forcing him to confront something he wasn't prepared to face. Kyle didn't stop running until he reached the edge of town. Gasping for air, his body trembling from the adrenaline, he looked back toward the woods. The figure was gone. The scream had faded into the distance, replaced by the eerie silence of the forest. But Kyle knew it wasn't over. Whatever lay in the woods, whatever ancient force had been calling to him, was still there, waiting for him to return. Kyle's fear had transformed into something else, a need to understand, to uncover the truth at any cost. He knew the answers were out there, deep in the heart of Timberline's cursed woods. But the cost of finding those answers was becoming clearer with each passing day. The land had its secrets, and Kyle was dangerously close to uncovering them, but would he be able to survive the truth? Or would Timberline claim another soul, as it had done so many times before? Kyle's fear had transformed into something else, a need to understand, to uncover the truth at any cost. He knew the answers were out there, deep in the heart of Timberline's cursed woods. But the cost of finding those answers was becoming clearer with each passing day. The land had its secrets, and Kyle was dangerously close to uncovering them, but would he be able to survive the truth? Or would Timberline claim another soul, as it had done so many times before? In the days following his terrifying encounter in the woods, Kyle became consumed by the idea that he had stumbled upon something far older than any of the legends. The scream that had echoed through Timberline was no longer just a cry of fear. It was a warning, an invitation, or maybe a summons. The land itself seemed to be alive, pulsing with a malevolent energy that Kyle could almost feel in his bones. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the figure again, standing at the edge of the cliff, watching him, waiting. It was as if it knew him, as if it had always known him, and now it wanted him to return. But even as the terror gripped him, Kyle couldn't stop himself. He had come too far, and there was too much left to uncover. He couldn't leave Timberline without answers, and so, with renewed determination, he returned to the woods. The night was still as he ventured into the forest once more. The air was thick with humidity, and the trees, tall and ancient, towered over him like silent sentinels. Kyle's flashlight flickered again, casting long, eerie shadows across the underbrush. The silence was unsettling, broken only by the soft crunch of his boots on the forest floor. For a moment, it felt like nothing had changed, the same stillness, the same weight of the unknown pressing down on him. But Kyle could feel it now, the tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. As he walked deeper into the woods, the ground beneath him shifted, becoming uneven, as though the earth was subtly pulling him toward something, toward a place he wasn't supposed to be. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, but the truth was just beyond reach, and he wasn't willing to let fear control him. He had to know what had happened to Jennifer, to the others, to the town itself. Hours passed, the forest seemingly stretching on forever. Then, as Kyle reached the Timberline overlook, he saw it, the cabin. It was no longer an abandoned relic of the past, but something fresh, something that had manifested in the woods since his last visit. The sight of it sent a shudder through his spine. The building stood at the edge of the forest, shrouded in mist, its outline barely visible against the dense fog. It was as if it had been waiting for him, calling him. His heart pounded in his chest as he approached. The cabin, its dark windows staring out like unblinking eyes, felt wrong in every way. It wasn't just the eerie appearance. It was the palpable sense of dread that seemed to emanate from the structure, like a dark presence that had made itself at home. The closer Kyle got, the stronger the feeling of being watched became. He could feel eyes on him, though there was no one to be seen. Stepping cautiously onto the porch, Kyle reached for the door, but it creaked open of its own accord, as though inviting him inside. He hesitated, his breath shallow, but then something inside him stirred and urged to press forward to uncover the truth. And so he crossed the threshold. The inside of the cabin was cold and damp, the air thick with the scent of decay. Dust covered the old furniture and cobwebs clung to the rafters. The atmosphere was oppressive, as if the cabin had been left undisturbed for years, yet there were signs of life. A half-filled glass of water sat on a table, and the faint smell of smoke lingered in the air, as though someone had been there only moments before. Kyle's flashlight swept across the room, illuminating old photographs pinned to the walls. Some were familiar faces, people Kyle had seen in old town records, while others were strangers, their faces blurred, their expressions vacant. In the far corner of the room, a pile of books and papers lay scattered across the floor. Something about them seemed out of place, too orderly amidst the chaos of the rest of the cabin. Kyle knelt down to examine them. The pages were yellowed and brittle, the writing scrawled in a hurried, frantic hand. They were filled with strange symbols, much like those he had seen in the woods. But it was the words that caught his attention. They were written in a language that he couldn't read, but the meaning was unmistakable. The land must be fed. A chill ran through Kyle as he picked up the final page in the pile. It was a map, its edges torn and frayed. The map depicted the very land surrounding Timberline, with markings that seemed to indicate specific locations, some in the forest, others near the town. The markings were too deliberate to be random, and the more Kyle studied them, the more he realized they aligned with the locations of the disappearances. This was no coincidence. Timberline wasn't just a place where people went missing, it was a place where something was being fed, something ancient, something dark. The land itself demanded a sacrifice, and Jennifer, along with the others, had been part of that sacrifice. The scream was the land's call for more, a cry for the next offering. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from somewhere deeper in the cabin. Kyle jumped, his heart racing. The noise had come from below, from the basement. He hesitated for a moment, the terror creeping back into his chest, but the need to know, the need to understand, was stronger than his fear. Taking a deep breath, he descended the narrow stairs into the basement. The air grew colder the further down he went, the darkness thickening around him. At the bottom of the stairs, he reached for the flashlight, only for it to flicker out. In the pitch-black darkness, Kyle's heart hammered in his chest. He fumbled with the flashlight, panic rising in his throat as he clicked it on again. The beam of light cut through the darkness, and there, standing in the center of the room, was the figure. The same figure he had seen in the woods, now more distinct, more real. It was tall, its face obscured by shadows, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Kyle froze, the figure didn't move. It simply stood there, watching him. "It's waiting for you," Kyle thought, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. The figure raised a hand, and Kyle's flashlight flickered once more, revealing the outline of a stone altar in the center of the room. The truth was no longer a question. The scream, the disappearances, the figures in the woods, they were all connected to the altar. The land had been demanding its price for centuries, and Timberline had paid it. The land wanted blood, and now it was calling for Kyle. Before he could react, the figure stepped forward, its form blurring in the dim light, and Kyle knew in that moment that there was no turning back. Timberline had claimed another soul. Before he could react, the figure stepped forward, its form blurring in the dim light, and Kyle knew in that moment that there was no turning back. Timberline had claimed another soul. The realization hit him like a wave of cold terror. The figure wasn't just a watcher, an observer. It was a part of something much darker, something ancient. It had been waiting for him, as if it knew he would come, knew he would reach the end of this trail of whispers and screams. The air in the basement grew thick, suffocating, the darkness seeming to press in from all sides, filling his lungs with a heavy, oppressive weight. Kyle's mind raced. He knew that the land, the forest, the Bennetts, they had all been part of a cycle, a ritual, a twisted offering to something beyond human understanding. He had come too far, uncovered too many truths to turn back now. The land wanted its price, and it had found its next victim. But Kyle refused to give in, not without a fight. He forced himself to take a step back, then another, his heartbeat pounding in his ears as the figure moved closer, its glowing eyes locked on him. A deep, low voice echoed from the shadows, the words barely audible but unmistakable. "The land takes what it is owed." The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was as though the very walls of the cabin were speaking to him, whispering his name, calling him into the abyss. Kyle stumbled backward, his hand desperately searching for anything to defend himself. His fingers brushed against something cold and hard, and he grabbed it without thinking. A large, rusted knife, half buried in the dirt beneath the floorboards. He didn't know if it would help, but it was all he had. The figure seemed to pause, as though it had been expecting this, as if it knew that Kyle would try to fight back. The air around them crackled with tension. The figure stepped closer again, its movement fluid, unnatural. Its presence felt like a magnetic force pulling Kyle toward it, urging him to surrender. "You cannot fight what you do not understand," the figure whispered, its voice now soft, almost coaxing. Kyle's breath quickened. He had to think, had to find a way out, but his mind was clouded with fear, with the sense that this moment had been inevitable. The sacrifices, the disappearances, the screams, they were all a part of something much larger, something that had been woven into the very fabric of Timberline. There was no escape. But even as Kyle stood frozen, his mind racing for an answer, a sudden noise cut through the tension. A faint rustling coming from behind him. For a moment, Kyle thought he had imagined it, but then he heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. He turned sharply, expecting to see another figure, another presence from the darkness. But instead, standing at the top of the stairs, was Ruth Bennett. Her eyes were wide with fear, her frail form bathed in the faint glow of Kyle's flickering flashlight. She looked more vulnerable than he had ever seen her, yet there was something resolute in her stance. "Stop," Ruth cried out, her voice shaking. "It's too late for you, Kyle, don't you see? You're already part of it." Kyle's heart pounded in his chest. The figure in the basement continued to move toward him, but Ruth's voice pierced the air, pulling him back from the edge of despair. She was right. He had already been drawn into Timberline's web. The land had claimed him, just as it had claimed so many before him. And now the cycle was complete. There was no escaping it. Ruth descended the stairs, her steps slow and measured. "You've uncovered too much, Kyle. There's no way out now. You've awakened it, and it will never let you go." Kyle's mind reeled as Ruth's words settled in. She was right. The figure, the scream, the land itself, they were all connected in ways he hadn't fully understood until now. The land was alive in a way that transcended human understanding. It had been feeding off the town's dark history for generations, and Kyle had unwittingly become part of that history. The moment he set foot in those woods, the moment he started searching for answers, he had sealed his fate. Ruth's eyes filled with sorrow as she looked at him. "I tried to warn you. The land chooses who it takes, and once it has you, there's no escaping it." Kyle swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. He wasn't just a victim of Timberline, he had been a part of it all along. The land had drawn him in just as it had drawn Jennifer and the others before her. There was no way to break the cycle. The town had been cursed from the very beginning, and now it was his turn to pay the price. But just as Kyle felt the despair beginning to consume him, something shifted. Ruth stepped closer, her face softening. "There is one way to stop it," she said quietly. "One way to break the curse, but you won't like it, and you won't survive it." Kyle's heart skipped a beat. What was she talking about? What could possibly break the curse if not the land itself? Ruth looked at the figure in the basement, her expression unreadable. The figure, for its part, had stopped moving, standing motionless as if waiting for the inevitable to unfold. "There's a ritual," Ruth continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "A final sacrifice, one last offering to appease the land. Only then will it stop. Only then will it release its grip." Kyle's stomach churned. The thought of becoming part of the land's twisted cycle, of offering himself as the final sacrifice, was unbearable. But the alternative, to remain trapped in Timberline's nightmare, to be consumed by the forest and its unyielding hunger, was worse. Ruth's gaze softened, and for the first time Kyle saw a glimmer of regret in her eyes. She stepped back, as if preparing herself for something she had known all along, something that had been inevitable. "Do you want to break the curse, Kyle?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling. "Do you want to save Timberline?" Kyle's mind raced. Could he do it? Could he offer himself to the land to stop the cycle, to save the town from the horrors that had claimed so many? Or was he destined to become yet another victim of Timberline's dark legacy? But as he stood there, the figure drawing closer again, Kyle knew there was only one choice. Timberline had claimed him, just as it had claimed the others, and the only way to stop it was to become part of the land itself. As the figure reached out, its cold hand brushing against his shoulder, Kyle closed his eyes. Timberline would never let go, but perhaps in his final act he could give the town what it needed. He could end the screams, end the disappearances, end the curse. "I'll save them," he whispered, the words barely escaping his lips. The figure's grip tightened, and in that moment Kyle knew it was over. The land had claimed its final victim. Timberline's curse would continue, but at least for now the screams would fade. And somewhere deep in the woods, the land would rest, waiting for the next offering. What would you do in Kyle's place? Would you make the ultimate sacrifice to end the curse, or would you fight for survival, even knowing the cost? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you're brave enough to uncover more chilling mysteries, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell for more terrifying stories from Timberline. Would you dare to stay in a town where the past never dies?